I think I'm not surprising anyone at this point by stating that the response to the second season of HBO's The Last of Us has been mixed at best. Now that the conversation around the show has mostly died down, I thought it would be an excellent moment for me to discuss what really happened with this season. The Last of Us 2 is a game that I've never wanted to cover on the channel just because of how toxic the conversation around the game has been, well, actually even before it launched. I wasn't gonna cover it in this essay either, but after thinking about it a lot, I've noticed that there's no way I can talk about the show without also discussing the game. After all, the way I perceive the second game deeply informs how I feel about the second season as a whole. That being said, I will avoid spoilers for the second half of the game on the most part, which will be adapted into seasons 3 and 4 of the TV show, well, presumably. So don't worry if you haven't played the second game, I won't spoil anything that hasn't been revealed by the show here. My thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2 have always boiled down to I appreciate it more than I actually enjoy it. The differentiation there is that I understand on a narrative level that they're taking a big swing. They're doing something really dramatic and something that the fans of the first game probably weren't expecting. Killing off Joel in the first hour, developing a backstory for his killer, and the ending of the narrative all pushed the boundaries of what was expected from the sequel to the hit game The Last of Us, and more importantly, what we expect from video games as a whole. In this way, The Last of Us 2 is undoubtedly in conversation with other narratives like it, a detail which the game itself brings up. The problem here is that those big narrative swings often miss. Not only does the narrative itself come off as manipulative, but the gameplay also fundamentally deals with the themes of the story. The amount of violence in this game is directly contradictory to the theme that it tries to present. After all, this is a game where you can, as Ellie, cosplay Rambo and pink mist people with dynamite arrows. To say that Ellie overreacts to the death of Joel would be an understatement, considering she kills half of Seattle. It's a theme that the game itself is aware of as well, but in a series that was created to combat the quote-unquote ludonarrative dissonance of Uncharted, it is endlessly funny to me that you can brutalize people like this. The overall tone of Part 2 is a dramatic departure from the first game as well, as it is clearly aiming for a Castan-esque, the sequel has to be darker than the original vibe. It all just creates this extremely oppressive mood, which I enjoyed the first time around, but have come to understand to be edgy to the point of annoyance on later playthroughs. As the location of Seattle implies, it's all about grunge this time around. But with that, let's get into Season 2 itself. The most interesting side about Season 2 of The Last of Us is that the screenwriters clearly have seen the conversations that took place around the release of the source material. Some of the changes in the TV show seem like direct quote-unquote corrections to things that a certain sect of the fandom has been complaining about for years now. Fandom in quotation marks, let's say. Here's an example. Abby's physique in the game is muscular. In fact, at one point she is referred to be built like an ox. This is a character detail that was in the game to display that she has been building herself up for the past 5 years to seek revenge on the man that killed her father. She's stationed in Seattle and is a part of the Wolves, who have a whole football stadium to themselves, including gyms for working out and plenty of food through agriculture. Despite this, there was a part of the audience that felt like Abby's physique would be completely unobtainable in the post-apocalypse, and they felt that it was, I guess, immersion breaking, or something like that. So bam, here's a solution. Let's just not make Abby as muscular in the adaptation. Here's another example. Many people criticize Joel's portrayal in Part 2 as a departure from Part 1. Here's this guy who was just 5 years prior the cynical killing machine, and now he's just a jolly old dude who gets trapped in a house with 7 complete strangers who are clearly armed to the teeth and sporting military fatigues. Not only that, but Tommy then goes on and tells the Salt Lake crew their names, and to some it just seemed like too much of a narrative convenience. So bam, here's another solution. Not only does Abby just overhear Joel's name as Dina calls to him, but he has to trust these people because he desperately needs their help as Jackson is defending against an onslaught of infected. On top of that, Dina actually has frostbite, so they have to take care of that as well. As a third minor example, even the notorious line of the biggest sandwiches has been cut from this version of the story.
Bigot sandwiches.
This season is filled to the brim with small fixes like that. It honestly feels to me like they entered the creation process for this season with the mindset that they were going to address every single thing that people raised against the second game and the first season. Some of you will probably remember from my video on the first season that I specifically complained about the world not feeling dangerous enough and that Jackson is for all intents and purposes a complete safe haven. Well, here in episode 2, Jackson is attacked by an onslaught of infected, as if the showrunners just ripped a page out of Game of Thrones. But even with these quote-unquote fixes implemented, people still largely hated this season. Not only did they not get the people that disliked the game, but they also seemingly lost the people that championed it as a masterpiece. In fact, the subreddit r The Last of Us 2, which is dedicated to hating the second game and the TV show, has been doing victory laps for the past 3 weeks, as the fans of the original game seemingly finally see the narrative like the people on that subreddit have seen it for the past 5 years. Even though the second season literally implements the fixes that they've been complaining about. In my mind, all of this boils down to the showrunners pandering to the wrong audience. They wanted to quote-unquote correct the record around the narrative of the original game, but ended up changing too much, alienating both fans and haters of the second game alike. This video is about analyzing why and how that happened. My intention here isn't to defend the second season, but to actually question why the screenwriters chose to change so much from the original. So let's start off by examining the biggest change in the season, that being the entire story structure that the original was built on. A common criticism against The Last of Us Part 2 was that the game buried the lead when it came to the motivations of its characters. Abby's motivation, as in why she wanted to play Wii Sports with Joel, is only revealed roughly 50% into the entire game. In a game that usually takes 24 hours to beat, that's 12 hours of not knowing why Abby did what she did and why she was so brutal about it. For context to those that have seen the show but haven't played the game, that first scene of Season 2 where Abby swears vengeance after burying the Fireflies in Salt Lake City is technically only revealed halfway through the entire game. It is an interesting spin revealing the quote-unquote other side that laid into the narrative, but ultimately it caused a lot of frustration in one part of the audience as they just wanted to kill her and be done with it. If I've learned anything about gamers, it is that sympathy doesn't really come in retroactively. Now that isn't to say that Abby isn't a good character overall though. For me personally, the problem isn't that we have to play as Abby, it's the way that the sympathy for her character is hammered into the player in that first sequence involving a certain character that Abby cares about a lot and a trapped animal. I'm obviously tiptoeing around because I don't want to spoil Season 3, if you know you know. It all just comes off incredibly manipulative, like the game itself is calling attention to the fact that you must sympathize with this character right now or the rest of this narrative doesn't work. So for me personally, it wasn't all that surprising that they decided to front-load this information in the adaptation. Empathy comes first. I mean, just think about it. If the adaptation stayed faithful to the source material, the show audience would only learn why Abby wanted to kill Joel at the beginning of Season 3, that is 2 years from now. The showrunners probably thought that this would be a far too long time to keep her motivation concealed, or maybe it would seem manipulative to start the third season off by emphasizing Abby's side of the story. By all accounts, it does seem after all that the third season is going to have much more of Abby than Season 2. Secondly, I suspect that the creators of the show saw that the character of Abby simply didn't connect with a group of players and they wanted to fix that. Just in case you weren't aware, there are video compilations of people purposefully failing at the game just to see Abby die.
Hey, kill it! Tommy! Put 2 in my chest! Tommy! Right here! One more time, Tom! Yeah, baby! Again! Fuck yeah! Fuck yeah!
I can't state this enough, the hatred for this character runs very deep. The grand narrative experiment of creating a heinous villain and then making the player empathize with them retroactively 12 hours into the game had seemingly failed for many people. Albeit, I've also seen many people champion this side of the game as their favorite thing about the narrative as a whole. So here they opted out of trying that again. Abby's motivation is front and center from the very beginning of Season 2, even though we don't get all the details. We see her having a presumably recurring nightmare about finding her dad in the operating room after Joel killed him, showing that his actions have traumatized her on a very deep level. So there, a clear motivation as to why she wants to kill Joel. Pretty much everyone in the audience should understand why she wants to do this. And you know what? It worked. For the most part, I think. By placing her motivation up front this time around, the discourse around the character hasn't been nearly as toxic. People didn't stop watching the show after episode 2, at least I haven't heard of that, nor was there a massive movement of people unsubscribing from HBO. There aren't subreddits dedicated to hating this character, or at least this version of the character, nor are people spreading misinformation that she's trans. This all happened with the game, by the way. The only cost? The narrative itself is far less complex and ambitious. Something that will be a very common theme moving forward, unfortunately. Ellie's initial motivation in the game, in turn, is about the brutality of Abby's actions. The player is supposed to feel angry towards Abby by design, not only because of the brutality of her methods, but also because she just came in and hit a triple bogey with our character from the first game. It's essentially her coming in and saying, "Oh, you were expecting more adventures with Joel and Ellie? Well, fuck you." But ultimately, Ellie's true motivation in the narrative, which is hidden from the player until the very ending of the game, is that the night before Joel was killed, the two had actually started to make amends. Abby didn't just kill Joel, she also robbed Ellie of the chance to make amends with him, also bringing into the foray the fact that she wasted the last few years that she could have had with him only if she had forgiven him earlier. The problem, however, is that without this context, the player is stuck with Ellie making a terrible decision of hunting Abby down, risking everyone around her for the entire game. We do not fully understand her motivations until the very end of the game, 24 hours in. So if you're 2 hours into The Last of Us Part 2 and Ellie has just entered Seattle and you think that this is a bad idea, I'll just say that you have a rough 10 hours up ahead. So here's another example of the showrunners moving up the motivation to earlier parts of the narrative, although with this example there is a smaller scale imitation of the game as the chat between Joel and Ellie is now revealed in the penultimate episode of the season instead of the ending of the entire narrative. So they kinda do hide it, but not to the extent that the game does. In fact, this scene combines two cutscenes from the game, those being 1, a moment where Ellie runs away from Jackson to Salt Lake City, by herself by the way, and discovers what really happened, and 2, the porch-side chat which happens at the end of the game. So once again, let's ask the question, why would they change this? I think the showrunners once again understood that concealing Ellie's true motivation like it's done in the game would be borderline impossible. Now imagine if episode 6 didn't have that reveal of Ellie going back to talk to Joel after the New Year's party, and at the end of season 4 in the Lord's year 2029, it was revealed that the two actually had a chat. That would mean concealing this small detail for years. By the time that season 4 would roll around, people would have already forgotten the scene of her walking past Joel. The internet would cry out that the screenwriters retconned this scene into the show because season 2 sucked and now they're trying to fix it. And you know, it does suck, but I'm just saying that's what people would say. In that sense, I can't really blame them for changing this, as people already forgot details week to week with this season. People were weirded out by Abby describing Joel as handsome, even though it is very clearly referring to the scene at the opening of the season in which she describes the things that she has learned about Joel. But on top of that, the narrative is just more compelling if we learn Ellie's motivation early on, instead of it being treated as a plot twist. I honestly wish that the game had used this as well. To me, the revelation of her true motivation just came far too late in the narrative and didn't affect me like it could have were it placed earlier in. So with that reasoning, I don't really see a problem with this change. Okay, now that I've run defense for the changes in motivation, let's get to the parts that Season 2 doesn't get right from the game. That being the characters. So as I mentioned in the beginning, another critique that was leveled against the game was that the character of Joel had been changed too much for the sequel. He gives his full name to strangers while also leaving his gear behind. That's weird. They shrank his shoulders, made him look soft. Personally, I never understood the argument of Joel becoming soft in the second game. Yes, it is a massive narrative blunder that Joel just happens to find Abby during a snowstorm and that Abby just happens to realize that this must be the Joel that she came looking for, and that Joel is gullible enough to follow her to quote-unquote safety. But Joel being less careful after the events of the first game actually makes more sense. He managed to get away scot-free from the Fireflies. He gained a new daughter in the process while also getting the opportunity to heal from his trauma of losing Sarah 20 years ago. He then manages to find a complete safe haven in the post-apocalypse where his brother lives. So is it really that surprising that he is less cynical in the second game? That he's so willing to trust a group of strangers passing through, especially because the game itself also establishes that traders do visit Jackson from time to time. That's the problem with sequels overall. You have a protagonist that goes through an arc designed to challenge and change them, and at the end of the original game, Joel isn't the same person that he was back in Boston. Ellie has changed him, something that the first season of the show actually stupidly says out loud.
So time heals all wounds, I guess?
It wasn't time that did it.
But for the sequel, most often the protagonist has to regress back to their original state for there to be another story to tell from their point of view. The Last of Us Part 2, despite its many flaws, managed to avoid this by having Joel genuinely change for the better. He is still very much adamant that he would save Ellie from the Fireflies if given the chance, but he isn't as cynical about the world as a whole. Which is why it's so interesting that in the adaptation, they decided to throw this nuance out the window. As I mentioned, Joel is still a pragmatist. He kills Eugene to avoid him turning near the town and risking everyone. He then proceeds to lie about Eugene's bravery to Gale. Not only does this establish that he is exactly the same dude that left that family stranded on the side of the road in Season 1, Episode 1, but it also shows that he really thinks that he can lie to a degree that people will believe his bullshit. On a similar note, he would refuse others from arriving in Jackson, even though he is only there because people welcomed him in. A common sentiment that I saw during the run of this season was that they made him soft again due to him taking therapy or something like that. This, however, undercuts the actual meaning of the scene between him and Gale, as the main purpose there is to clearly, plainly, show to the audience that Joel still thinks that he was completely justified in his actions against the Fireflies. He isn't in therapy because he is soft and needs to vent about the awful things that he has done to survive. He's in therapy because Ellie won't talk to him. That's all there is to it. He thinks that Gale will magically give him the answer as to how he can get Ellie back, not realizing that the reason Ellie doesn't want to hang out with him is the exact same reason that the therapy fails with Gale. He can't bring himself to talk about what he did. As I didn't have a problem with Joel in The Last of Us Part 2, I won't spend too much time here beating a dead horse. However, it is notable that this regression in character happens in the adaptation. I am genuinely surprised that people came to the conclusion that they made him soft again, when the very opposite is true. But with that, let's move on to Abby. Caitlin Dever as Abby is perfectly serviceable, albeit the feeling of the character is totally different from the game. This version of Abby seems more sad than angry, which kinda takes away from the narrative as Abby is supposed to be intimidating. In my opinion, she doesn't need to have the muscles, but she still needs to be menacing at least in some other way. This character is supposed to be an impossible challenge for Ellie to eventually face, and honestly, during this season I did not get that vibe at all. She's not really present for most of the season, so there isn't much much else to say about the performance up until this point. As Season 3 seems to be adapting her side of The Last of Us Part 2, I'm sure I'll have more to say when we get there. Okay, now we're getting into the actual meat and potatoes of this video. Viewers of my previous video on Season 1 will recall that I suggested that the problem with Ellie as a character wasn't Bella Ramsey, but the way that the character was written. To be specific, I noted that Ramsey's portrayal of Ellie either hits 100% or it misses entirely, noting specifically a scene where Druckmann and Mazin saw a hint of guilt from her, which I personally didn't see in the slightest. So it is perhaps no surprise that my take here is pretty much the same for the season, with the exception that the way the character is written this season is truly baffling, even more so than Season 1. Throughout the season, Ellie acts impulsively, beginning in Episode 1, in which she decides to roll duo on a supermarket with some infected in it. She does this, gets bitten, and then proceeds to do similar stupid stuff in the later episodes as well, learning nothing essentially. Now, I get that they have to establish that Ellie is impulsive enough to go on a journey to Seattle to avenge Joel, but then again, it just makes for an incredibly frustrating watch when the audience clearly sees that she is making stupid judgment calls again and again and again. Why in the living fuck would she be willing to take on 6 wolves, armed to the teeth by the way, to save one single Seraphite she doesn't even know? Especially knowing that this would cut her journey of vengeance short and even possibly leave Dina to fend for herself. Now I know that this version of the character has an inflated sense of purpose and that she is still recovering from seeing her father figure be skewered like a shish kebab, but it just feels kinda ridiculous that she would be willing to risk her and Jesse's lives for this one Seraphite, especially because she then goes on to abandon Tommy to pursue her vengeance against Abby in the very next scene. These two scenes happen 16 minutes apart in the show. It's ridiculous. It is inconsistencies like this in the character that drag the entire season down. When Ellie went to Seattle in the original game, she was out for blood. She did not take a moment to try to save anyone except Dina. Her mission was very clear: get Abby, get out. That anger towards everyone is very much a defining characteristic of her in the original game. And don't get it twisted, Ellie being impulsive this season is not equal to her being furious in the game. These are two totally different emotions that convey a completely different set of mind. Here in the show, it genuinely doesn't feel like Ellie is even that angry about the whole affair. Where Ramsey's choices to portray Ellie as more moody, guarded, and downright goofy work at times, it takes away from the narrative as a whole. Admittedly, they fixed my complaints about the edgy tone of the original, but at least that version felt like it was based on some ethos. This is, after all, supposed to be the darker second act of a potential trilogy. In the show, the tone is all over the place. It feels like I'm getting emotional whiplash when one moment Ellie is joking about not knowing what triangulation is, and the next she is torturing someone with a pipe, and in the end admitting that it was easy. As subscribers of this channel will remember, I already raised the point in my previous video that Ellie is probably more interested in violence in Season 1 as they're setting up this turn of the character for Season 2. This was done so that the extreme violence of Season 2 doesn't feel out of character. And come to find out, they didn't actually do anything with that side of the character this season, so why the fuck is Ellie so violent in Season 1? I've also seen many people complain about the lack of violence this season, but honestly, if you've seen the first season, this shouldn't be a surprise. What works in a TV show is just fundamentally different than what works in gameplay. Not having Ellie kill 50 wolves or scars is not a flaw in the storytelling. In fact, the opposite would be jarring, suspension of disbelief breaking even. However, if you are adapting a story about the cycle of violence and how Ellie kills people that didn't even have a part in that cycle of violence, creating even more cycles of violence as a result, you still need to have some violence. Sure, you can't replicate the Ramboification of Ellie from the original game, nor should you, but you can't really sweep the violence under the rug either. It is a core part of the story. Ellie technically only kills 4 people this season, those being the TV station dude, Nora, Mel, and Owen. 5 if you count the baby, and I think Ellie does count the baby. Overall, it feels more realistic in a I'm watching television sense, but then again, in a season in which Ellie doesn't feel angry about Joel's death, you know, the whole reason she's in Seattle, It doesn't work at all. You can't have it both ways. She can't feel this passive towards the Salt Lake City crew and still kill them brutally. Not to mention that the first kill of this group comes far too late into the season, as she kills Nora in episode 5. There are only 7 episodes this season. In this sense, it was truly an odd move to remove Jordan of the Salt Lake crew from the narrative entirely. He is the first member of the gang that Ellie takes out after all in the game. In that version of the story, it was rather anticlimactic, but here it could have worked wonders. Have Ellie kill early in the season after coming to Seattle. Actually remind the audience as to why she is there in the first place and that she really does mean business. Have the guts to make it brutal and make us wonder as to if Ellie's revenge is really worth it. So many of these changes seem like they're the end result of trying to neuter the character of Ellie. I don't know if they wanted people to lay off the Bella Ramsey hate or something like that, but in a narrative where the protagonist is supposed to be morally dubious, you can't tippy-toe around these kinds of plot points. Why does she say that Nora might have not deserved the torture? Why isn't she annoyed when she finds out that Dina is pregnant? The one person she loves in this entire world is now a liability. She should be furious as she is in the game. Not only because I have a preference for that version of the character from the game, but also because her choice of going after Abby even when Tommy is in danger needs to be established somehow. Are you seriously trying to tell me that this version of the character would actually abandon Tommy? No. Episode 6 of the season, titled The Prize, is the only episode where I truly felt like Bella Ramsey was the character from the game, but apart from that, this season was a mixed bag on the acting and the character building sides, the exact same gripes that I had with season 1 of the show, well, on steroids this time around, I guess. Wow, I just realized that I didn't even mention the island bit where Ellie just gets away scot-free from a bunch of Seraphites that are about to hang her and got her, but they let her go because killing her most definitely would have taken too much time or something. I don't know. Like, this scene is so egregiously bad that it has to be some sort of setup for the 3rd season. Like, some other character will somehow benefit from this distraction or some shit like that. But my god, there is no wiggle room at all for this part. It's genuinely baffling that this made into the final product, especially because it adds nothing to the narrative at this moment. So where does this leave us? At the end of the day, I believe that the showrunners were making a show for one specific type of audience, that being the people that have not played the games. Although I can't really prove it, nor do Mazin or Druckmann mention this, but they seemingly saw the critique that was leveled against the original game and the first season and decided to focus on fixing those elements, ultimately breaking what made the original so special in the first place. This thing is catered to the exact wrong audience. Why are you adapting this with me or the absolute haters of the game in mind? There are many people that champion Part 2 as a masterpiece. This thing should have been adapted for them. I've always appreciated The Last of Us Part 2 more than I've actually enjoyed it. It's a game that aims so high in its ambitions of subverting the tropes of a revenge tale that it forgets to tell a compelling story in the first place. It's not a game that I return to like I returned to the original The Last of Us because of its oppressive grunge mood. But even with that said, I simply do not see a compelling reason to watch the show instead of playing the game. I said a similar thing about the first season when I covered it on the channel in my previous video, but at least there I understood that the showrunners were attempting to make the narrative of the game more approachable. Here, in that same ambition, they've created something that not only doesn't live up to the original, but it fundamentally doesn't even understand what made it so interesting. Thanks for watching.